It was just another regular flight, or so it seemed. The plane hummed steadily through the air, passengers settled in their seats, and the flight attendants made their rounds, offering drinks and snacks. But for one family, this flight was about to turn into something they'd never forget. Meet Jada, a bright, confident young woman, on her way to visit family. Jada was excited, maybe a little nervous, but nothing could prepare her for the incident that would unfold. She was the kind of person who always tried to stay calm, always polite, even when things got tense. But this time, she was pushed to the edge in a way she never thought possible. It all started when she asked a simple question to one of the flight attendants. She just wanted to know if she could change her seat. It wasn't a big deal, and she wasn't being demanding. In fact, she was polite and respectful, but for some reason the attendant didn't see it that way. Instead of simply offering assistance, the flight attendant snapped at Jada, her words sharp and unwelcoming. Jada tried to brush it off, thinking it was just a moment of bad attitude. But what happened next left her speechless. The attendant, still irritated, took it further. Without warning, she raised her hand and struck Jada, the blow landing on her shoulder. The sound of the slap echoed in the cabin, and for a moment, everything went still. Passengers around them looked on in shock, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Jada, stunned and hurt, could hardly believe it. How had something so small escalated into such a violent act? But what the flight attendant didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Jada wasn't just another passenger. Her father, a successful businessman, owned the very airline they were flying with. Jada had always kept a low profile when it came to her family, but in this moment, everything was about to change. What would happen when the truth came out? Would the flight attendant face the consequences of her actions? Jada wasn't sure what to do. She didn't want to make a scene, but she couldn't just let this go. She sat there, frozen, as the realization set in. She was caught in the middle of something that felt so wrong, and yet so out of her control. Her heart raced as she weighed her options. Should she let this slide, or should she confront the situation head-on? In the quiet that followed, tension built like a storm ready to burst. Jada could feel eyes on her from every corner of the cabin, waiting for her to make the next move. What would she do? And what would happen when her father found out? Would the attendant be held accountable for what she had done? The stakes had just been raised, and the flight would never be the same again. But the real question was, who would be the first to face the fallout of this shocking encounter? Would Jada speak up, or would she stay silent for the sake of peace? The answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. This was a situation that no one on that plane would ever forget. The tension was building, and the moment of truth was fast approaching. To find out what happens next, stay tuned for the next part of the story. Jada sat there in disbelief, her mind racing as the shock of what had just happened began to sink in. The flight attendant's harsh words, the strike to her shoulder, it felt like a nightmare unfolding in real time. Jada had always prided herself on staying calm under pressure, but right now, every inch of her body was screaming for action. She had been hit by a flight attendant, and it wasn't just any flight attendant. It was someone who was supposed to help make the passengers' experience better, safer. How could this have happened? As the plane continued its steady hum through the skies, Jada's thoughts raced back to the moment when she had asked the flight attendant for a simple favor. She had been seated in an aisle seat, hoping for a little more space during the flight, and thought that maybe switching seats would make the journey a bit more comfortable. She wasn't expecting anything complicated, just a small request. But the attendant had looked at her with a scowl, barely hiding the irritation in her eyes. Maybe it had been a long day, maybe the woman was just tired, but Jada hadn't deserved that kind of treatment. The flight attendant, whose name Jada hadn't even caught, had made an exaggerated sigh before responding curtly, "This isn't a hotel, you know." Her tone had been sharp, dismissive, as if Jada's request was an imposition rather than a simple inquiry. Jada had felt the heat rising in her chest, but she held it back, keeping her voice steady as she'd apologized and said it wasn't a big deal. Still, the woman had continued, making passive-aggressive remarks under her breath, comments Jada could barely make out but could feel. When the flight attendant had raised her hand and struck her, Jada couldn't process the sudden surge of anger and humiliation. The slap, though not particularly hard, felt like a slap to her dignity, a slap to everything she stood for. It wasn't about the force, it was about the disrespect, the total disregard for her as a person. And in front of so many people, the moment had seemed frozen in time, a heavy silence filling the space as everyone in the row looked from Jada to the attendant, unsure of what to do. Jada glanced around, meeting the eyes of a couple seated a few rows ahead. They were staring at her, mouths slightly open, likely still processing what they had witnessed. The older man quickly turned his gaze away, as if embarrassed, while his partner remained fixed on Jada, her expression a mix of shock and sympathy. But no one spoke up. It was as if the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting for someone to take control of the situation. But Jada couldn't bring herself to do anything just yet. What bothered Jada even more was how the attendant simply walked away, as if nothing had happened. No apology, no acknowledgement of the act she had just committed. She walked down the aisle with the same efficiency as before, as though slapping a passenger was part of her regular routine. Jada took a deep breath and tried to collect herself. This wasn't like her. She was the kind of person who didn't make waves, who avoided conflict at all costs. But this was different. It wasn't just an uncomfortable moment, it was an outright violation. And no one, especially not her, was going to let this go unnoticed. She pulled her phone out of her bag and typed a quick message to her father, the one person she could count on in moments like these. But she hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could she say? How could she explain something like this in a text? And should she even tell him yet? Jada had always been careful to keep her personal life out of the spotlight, especially when it came to her family's business. She didn't want to make it seem like she was using her father's connections to get ahead or solve problems. But this wasn't about status. This was about principle. The thought of calling her father crossed her mind, but that would be a bigger leap. Her father was a busy man, and this was something she didn't want to burden him with unless it was absolutely necessary. But as the moments ticked by and the flight attendant remained oblivious to the tension she had caused, Jada's resolve started to strengthen. If she didn't speak up, who would? She couldn't just let this go. The slap had been a sign of something deeper, something ugly. It wasn't just about a bad attitude or a bad day. It was a reflection of how some people viewed others, how they could treat someone like they didn't matter. And Jada wasn't going to stand for that. She made up her mind. She would confront the flight attendant. She would demand an explanation. And she would do it on her own terms, without relying on anyone to fix it for her. Jada stood up, her movements slow but deliberate, and walked toward the back of the plane. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she ignored it. She had a goal now, and nothing was going to stop her. She could see the flight attendant at the back of the cabin, speaking with a colleague, her back turned. Jada's footsteps were soft, but each one felt heavier than the last, the distance between her and the attendant seeming to stretch longer with each passing second. She reached the last row and cleared her throat. The attendant turned around, eyes narrowing as if she were about to dismiss Jada again. But Jada wasn't giving her the chance. "I need to talk to you," Jada said, her voice steady but firm. "Right now." The flight attendant blinked, clearly surprised by the sudden confrontation. For a moment, Jada thought the woman might brush her off, but instead, she folded her arms across her chest, giving her a cold, hard stare. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still carrying that same edge. Jada's eyes narrowed as she spoke. "I don't know if you realize what just happened, but I was just struck by you, and I need an explanation." The attendant's posture stiffened, her jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about." Jada could feel the tension between them growing, the air thick with unresolved conflict. The attendant was denying it, denying what everyone had seen, denying that she had just crossed a line no one should ever cross. I'm talking about the slap, Jada said, her voice rising slightly, though she was careful not to shout. You hit me for asking a simple question, and you have yet to apologize for it. The flight attendant's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, Jada heard a voice behind her. A deep, authoritative voice. It was one she recognized instantly, and it sent a chill down her spine. What's going on here? The voice was calm, but it carried an undeniable sense of command. Jada turned around slowly, and her heart nearly stopped. Standing in the aisle, a few rows behind her, was none other than her father. Jada's stomach dropped when she saw her father standing there, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the first time she'd seen him in a business context, but this situation, this confrontation, was different. This wasn't a meeting in his office or a conference call. This wasn't about contracts or partnerships. This was personal. This was about her, and it was unfolding in front of everyone on the plane. Her father, Malcolm Davis, was not just any businessman. He was the owner of the Airline, the very company that employed the flight attendant who had just slapped his daughter. And now he was standing there, in the middle of this tense standoff, his presence suddenly making everything feel more real. The stakes were higher now, and Jada could feel her pulse quicken as the weight of the moment sank in. The flight attendant's eyes widened when she saw Malcolm. Her stance stiffened, and for a split second, Jada saw a flicker of fear cross the woman's face. But just as quickly, she regained her composure and put on a mask of professionalism. She straightened her uniform and took a breath before speaking, her voice now laced with a forced calmness. Mr. Davis, she began, but her words faltered as Malcolm raised a hand, silencing her. I'll handle this, he said, his voice firm but controlled. There was no hint of anger in his tone, but Jada could hear the authority beneath it. It was the voice of a man used to taking charge, to commanding respect. But there was also something else, something Jada couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way he glanced at her briefly before turning back to the flight attendant, or the way his jaw tightened just a little. She couldn't be sure, but it made her uneasy. Jada wanted to speak up, to say something, but the words caught in her throat. Her father had always been a man of few words when it came to handling business matters. He didn't like drama, didn't like being put in the position of conflict, and here he was, standing in the very situation he most likely dreaded, his daughter confronting an employee in front of other passengers. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the power dynamic now at play. She had been caught in a lie, and now the truth was staring her down. Jada could sense that the woman was trying to figure out her next move, how to salvage her dignity, how to make it seem like the situation wasn't as bad as it seemed. But Jada wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not this time. Malcolm's gaze softened when he turned to Jada. It was the kind of look he gave her when they were alone, when he didn't have to put on a business persona. But even in this moment, Jada could see that he was trying to keep his emotions in check. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but she could feel the tension between them. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from conflict, but he also knew that sometimes the best way to handle something was to let it play out. He had built an empire on making tough decisions, but this wasn't about a boardroom negotiation. It was about his daughter's dignity. I didn't want to make a scene, Jada said, her voice quiet but firm. But she hit me, Dad, in front of everyone. Malcolm's eyes darkened as he turned back to the flight attendant. Is this true? The woman, now visibly uncomfortable, hesitated before answering. I didn't hit her. It was a misunderstanding. She looked to Jada for confirmation, but Jada wasn't about to let the woman rewrite the truth. That's not true, Jada replied, her voice steady. She slapped me. I didn't do anything to provoke her. Malcolm's expression remained unreadable, but Jada could see the gears turning in his mind. He wasn't quick to judge, but this was no ordinary situation. He was a businessman, not a parent in this moment, and Jada knew how much he valued his reputation. The last thing he wanted was for his company to be embroiled in a scandal, especially one involving his own daughter. But Jada also knew that her father, for all his business acumen, would stand up for her in a way that no one else could. There was a long pause before Malcolm finally spoke again, his voice colder now, more authoritative. "If what she's saying is true, then this is unacceptable. No one on my team behaves like this. No one." The flight attendant's face flushed, and for a moment, Jada saw a flicker of fear. She was beginning to realize just how serious this was. She wasn't just dealing with an upset passenger anymore. She was facing the wrath of the man who owned the entire airline. "Mr. Davis, I didn't mean any harm," the flight attendant stammered, her eyes darting nervously between him and Jada. "It was just a misunderstanding." "I don't care about your excuses," Malcolm cut in, his tone sharp. "You don't lay a hand on any passenger, no matter the circumstances. You're lucky this isn't being handled in a more serious way right now." Jada could see the flight attendant's face go pale. The weight of Malcolm's words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire plane had fallen silent. Even the flight attendants in the front cabin seemed to sense the shift in power. Jada could feel the eyes of the other passengers on them, their gaze heavy with curiosity. What was going to happen next? Was this the end of the story, or just the beginning of something bigger? Jada shifted uncomfortably, feeling the pressure of everyone's attention. Her father was a powerful man, and she knew that. But right now, she didn't want him to solve this for her. She wanted to take control of her own story. She needed him to see that she was capable of handling this herself, of standing up for herself, without hiding behind his name. "I'm not looking for her to be fired, Dad," Jada said, surprising herself with the calmness in her voice. "I just want her to understand that she can't do this to people." Malcolm looked at her, his eyes softening for a moment, but his next words were still sharp, cutting through the tension in the air. "I'll handle it. Don't worry about her." But Jada wasn't sure she could just let it go. The slap wasn't just about the flight attendant, it was about something bigger. About how people treated others when they thought there would be no consequences. About how power dynamics worked, and how quickly they could shift. It wasn't just a matter of right and wrong. It was about how far people would go when they thought they were untouchable. As Malcolm turned to speak with the flight attendant, Jada couldn't help but feel a wave of uncertainty. Had she made the right choice by standing up for herself? Was there more at stake here than just a single incident? The tension in the air remained thick, and the flight seemed to stretch on forever, each minute heavier than the last. Jada knew that no matter how this situation was resolved, the ripples would be felt long after they landed, and for the first time, she felt the weight of her father's world, a world she was now a part of in a way she never had been before. The plane seemed to stretch endlessly, the rhythmic hum of the engines doing little to drown out the tension that had settled over the cabin. Jada sat back down in her seat, her heart still racing, but her mind spinning even faster. Her father was speaking with the flight attendant, his words low but firm, and the look on the woman's face was a mix of shock and fear. She knew that whatever happened next, her life on this flight, perhaps even her job, was hanging by a thread. Jada could see it in the way she kept glancing over at her, her expression full of guilt and confusion. But Jada wasn't sure if it was guilt for what she had done, or guilt for the consequences that were about to come crashing down on her. For the first time, Jada found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about power, about respect, and about how the world worked. Her father was a man who had built an empire, someone who was used to making decisions that affected thousands. He didn't deal with small problems like this, not ones that didn't have a clear solution. As Malcolm spoke quietly with the attendant, Jada couldn't ignore the knot tightening in her stomach. This was no longer just about her. The incident, the slap, had turned into something bigger than either of them could have imagined. The other passengers, still mostly silent, were starting to whisper amongst themselves, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, and Jada knew that whatever came next, it wasn't going to be easy. The flight attendant's eyes darted between Jada and Malcolm, clearly calculating her options, But it was clear she knew that her position was precarious. She had been caught in a lie, and there was no way out now. Jada's father wasn't the type of man to let something like this slide, especially when it was a direct assault on his family. And as much as Jada wanted to speak up, to make her own stand, she found herself trapped in her own uncertainty. The tension was unbearable, and yet time seemed to slow down, each minute stretching into eternity. It wasn't just the uncertainty of what was about to happen, it was the feeling of being caught between two worlds. Her father, in all his power and authority, represented a world Jada wasn't entirely sure she wanted to be a part of. His business decisions, his management of the airline, had always been distant to her. She had never been involved in the day-to-day operations of the company, preferring to stay away from the spotlight and let her father handle it all. But now, here she was, in the thick of it. As the minutes dragged on, Malcolm finally broke away from the flight attendant, his face unreadable. He looked over at Jada, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. He didn't say anything, but the weight of his gaze told her everything she needed to know. He was taking this seriously. He wasn't going to let the flight attendant get away with what she had done. But what would that mean for her? For the flight? For the people who had witnessed it? Jada felt a wave of anxiety wash over her, and as she glanced around the cabin, she saw the passengers starting to whisper more audibly now, their voices filled with curiosity, speculation, and even judgment. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting. What would happen to the flight attendant? What would her father do? And most importantly, what would Jada do? The flight attendant seemed to be spiraling, her confidence crumbling with every second. She had tried to apologize, tried to downplay the situation, but Malcolm hadn't been fooled. His silence had been louder than any words he could have spoken. He was giving her a chance to redeem herself, to show some semblance of accountability. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that the woman wasn't taking this seriously. Jada's fingers tightened around the armrest, her mind racing. She knew her father was a man of principle, someone who wouldn't tolerate disrespect toward his family or anyone under his company's banner. But what would he do next? Would he fire the attendant on the spot? Would he take legal action? Would he be able to keep the situation contained? Or was this the moment everything started to unravel? A sense of dread began to creep up Jada's spine. She had always known her father was a powerful figure, but she had never truly understood the weight of that power until now. She had always kept a safe distance from his world, avoiding the drama and the consequences that came with it. But this time, she was caught in the middle of it, unable to escape. And as the minutes ticked by, she realized that this wasn't just about the flight attendant. It was about how far she was willing to go to take control of her own story. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I think we need to have a serious conversation about your conduct," Malcolm said, his tone cold and deliberate. The words hung in the air, each one carrying an undeniable weight. "I'll be speaking to the crew at the next stop, and I expect a full report. This isn't something that can be brushed aside. Understand?" The flight attendant's face had drained of color by now. She nodded quickly, her lips trembling slightly. But Jada could see the conflict in her eyes. She didn't want to lose her job. She didn't want to face the consequences of her actions. And yet, Jada knew that the woman had crossed a line. There was no going back now. As the plane continued its flight, the uncertainty in the air seemed to grow heavier. Jada couldn't escape the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. She wasn't sure what would happen next, whether her father would carry through with his promises, or whether the situation would turn into something even bigger than either of them could handle. What if the fallout from this confrontation spread beyond the flight? What if the story made headlines? What if the media got involved? The unease in Jada's chest only deepened as the minutes stretched on. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. And as the plane began its descent toward the next airport, she knew the moment of reckoning was coming. Everything was about to change. And no one, not even her father, could predict how it would all play out. Would the flight attendant be held accountable for her actions, or would she find a way to turn the situation around? What would happen to Jada, caught in the middle of a conflict that was bigger than her? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And everything Jada thought she knew about her family, her father, and herself was about to be challenged in ways she couldn't yet imagine. As the plane descended, Jada could feel her heartbeat pounding in her chest, the pressure of the moment pressing down on her like a vice. She wasn't sure what to expect when they landed, but she knew it would be monumental. The flight attendant's future was uncertain, her father's decision looming over the situation. But just as she thought the storm was starting to settle, a new and unexpected wave of tension hit. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching our landing. Please prepare for arrival." But Jada's attention was elsewhere. She felt a strange unease creeping up her spine, like something was about to go terribly wrong. Her father, still seated beside her, seemed to have his mind focused on the flight attendant, his eyes narrowing occasionally as he glanced toward the front. But then his phone buzzed, an alert from his assistant, and for the first time, Jada saw a flicker of genuine concern flash across his face. "Is everything okay?" Jada asked, her voice tentative, but her curiosity now piqued. She knew her father well enough to see when something was troubling him beyond the obvious. Malcolm didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered over the phone's screen, his jaw tightening. Then, with a heavy sigh, he set it down on the tray table and leaned in toward Jada. "We might have a bigger problem," he said, his voice low but intense. Jada's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" she asked, unable to hide the alarm in her voice. Malcolm took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the cabin before he spoke again, as if making sure no one was listening. "There's been a leak. Someone at the airline has been spreading rumors, and now it's all over social media." Jada's mind spun, trying to process what he was saying. What kind of rumors? Her father hesitated, his gaze turning more focused, almost as if he was still weighing the impact of the information. The flight attendant wasn't just acting out of stress. Someone had tipped her off about a possible promotion, under the table, no formal process. And now, people are saying it's part of a larger scandal. That someone in the company has been involved in bribery, using their position to push employees ahead without merit. Jada's heart sank. This wasn't just a minor incident anymore. This was escalating into something that could shake the entire airline. She could feel the weight of her father's words hitting her like a ton of bricks. Her father's company, his empire, was built on trust and reputation. If these rumors were true, it could unravel everything he had worked for. And if it all came out now, if the media caught wind of this, it would be the worst possible timing. "So, it wasn't just this flight attendant?" Jada asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm nodded grimly. "No, she's just the tip of the iceberg. The allegations are spreading, and now there's talk of a bigger investigation. It could be worse than I thought." He paused, rubbing his temples as the stress of the situation began to show. "I need to handle this carefully. This isn't just about her anymore, it's about the entire integrity of the company." Jada's thoughts raced, trying to connect the dots. The flight attendant's slap had been the spark, but now it seemed as though the fire had grown out of control. What started as a personal conflict was now entangled in corporate corruption, and her family was at the center of it. Was this a setup? Was someone deliberately trying to sabotage her father's reputation? It seemed too coincidental, too dangerous. The thought that this could all be part of a larger scheme was chilling. As the plane touched down and began taxiing toward the gate, the air inside the cabin felt heavier than ever. Jada felt trapped, caught in the eye of a storm she had never anticipated. She wasn't just a passenger on this flight anymore, she was part of something much bigger. And the reality of it all was beginning to hit her. Her father was calm on the surface, but she could see the worry lines deepening on his face. He wasn't just fighting for justice for her, he was now fighting for the survival of his empire. The flight attendant, who had been standing nervously at the front, waiting to be called by her supervisor, now seemed even more jittery than before. Jada could tell she was overwhelmed by everything that had transpired, but there was something else in her eyes now, a flicker of suspicion. Had she known about the rumors? Had she been a pawn in a much larger game? As the plane came to a halt and the seatbelt sign flickered off, Jada stood up, still reeling from everything her father had just told her. She was caught between two worlds, her loyalty to her father and her own desire to see justice done. The world her father navigated was full of power plays, business maneuvers, and cold, hard facts. But Jada was learning that sometimes those same powers could be used against you. And then, just as they were preparing to disembark, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the notification. The message was from an unknown number, the words simple but chilling. "Asterisk, we know everything. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Asterisk. Her pulse spiked, and her hands went cold as the weight of the message sunk in. It wasn't just the rumors anymore. Someone knew something, someone with enough knowledge to threaten everything. Was this an anonymous warning? Or was someone within her father's company trying to manipulate her? Was the flight attendant involved, or was she just a pawn in a much larger game? The stakes had just been raised, and Jada realized, with a sinking feeling, that everything she had known up until now was about to be tested in ways she couldn't have imagined. The story wasn't just about a slap anymore. It was about the future of the airline, her family's legacy, and the power of secrets and lies. Her father turned to her, his face hardening as he saw the look on her face. He could tell something had changed, something more was at play than he had let on. Jada didn't know what to say. The calm, measured man she had always looked up to was suddenly vulnerable, and the world around them seemed far more dangerous than she had ever realized. "Jada," Malcolm said, his voice low, almost a warning. "We need to get out of here, now." As the passengers began to disembark, Jada felt the weight of everything crash down on her. She wasn't sure who she could trust, what the truth even was, or who was pulling the strings behind it all. But one thing was certain: the calm, familiar world she had known was shattering, and she was right at the center of it all. And as the chaos began to swirl around them, she couldn't help but wonder just how deep the conspiracy went, and whether anyone, including her father, was truly safe from what was coming next. As they exited the plane, the weight of everything that had happened still hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Jada's mind was racing, her thoughts fragmented as she tried to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded over the past few hours. Her father had pulled her aside immediately, and they moved swiftly through the airport, bypassing the usual protocols. There was no time for pleasantries or questions. Not now. Malcolm's phone buzzed again. He didn't even look at the screen this time. His jaw clenched, and he moved faster, his eyes scanning the room. He was determined, but Jada could tell he was worried. She had never seen him so on edge. It wasn't just the rumors or the flight attendant's slap anymore. It was everything: the company, the employees, and now this new threat that seemed to be looming over them both. The text message still burned in her pocket. "Asterisk, we know everything. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Asterisk. The anonymous warning hung over her like a dark cloud. Who was behind it? Was it just an empty threat? Or was someone inside her father's company actively trying to destroy everything they had built? They reached the airport lounge, a place Jada had always found refuge, a place her father often came to unwind. But today, it felt like a fortress on the brink of collapse. Malcolm sat down and placed his hands on the table, his eyes locked onto hers. The calmness in his demeanor was almost terrifying now, as though he was bracing himself for something bigger. "I'm calling a meeting with the board," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "We'll have to face this head-on. The leaks, the rumors, they can't keep spreading." Jada nodded, her mind spinning. The calmness in his voice felt at odds with the chaos that was unfolding, but she knew him well enough to understand that his strategy was to remain composed. But something was off, something deeper. She felt the lingering sense that they were being watched, that someone was always one step ahead. Before she could speak, her phone buzzed once more. This time it wasn't a message, it was a call. Unknown number. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her pulse quickening. Hello. The voice on the other end was low and distorted, deliberately masked. Your father won't be able to stop it, you know. It's already too late. The words sent a chill down her spine, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. This wasn't a random threat. This was someone who knew too much. Who is this? She demanded, her voice rising in both fear and defiance. But the voice only laughed, dark and unsettling. You'll find out soon enough. Just make sure you're prepared. The truth always comes out. The line went dead, leaving only a heavy silence in its wake. Jada looked at her father, her hands trembling. Dad, something's happening. I don't think we're dealing with just rumors anymore. Malcolm's face hardened. He reached for his phone, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. I'll get to the bottom of this, he muttered, more to himself than to her. But I need to know everything. Just as Jada opened her mouth to speak, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message or a call. It was a video, a grainy, shaky clip that made her stomach drop the moment it started playing. What do you want? Malcolm demanded, his voice cracking with disbelief. Natalie smiled, a wicked, almost satisfied smile. It's too late now. I already have what I need. The company's already in motion. And no one, not even you, can stop it. As she walked toward the door, Jada's mind raced, the gravity of the situation fully sinking in. Natalie wasn't just after revenge. She was after power, and she had already won. But just as Natalie reached for the door, she paused, looking over her shoulder with a final chilling remark. You'll see soon enough, Jada. You've been a part of this all along. You just didn't know it yet. With that, she disappeared into the corridor, leaving Jada and her father standing in the room, breathless and stunned. The stakes had been raised higher than they could have ever imagined, and the war for control of the airline was just beginning. And the biggest shock of all? Jada realized she wasn't just a bystander in this game. She was a player, and the game was far from over. Jada stood frozen, her heart racing, as the sound of Natalie's footsteps faded into the distance. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. She could barely process what had just happened. Betrayal, power, and now, an even bigger realization. She had been caught up in a game that was much larger than she had ever imagined. Her father's usually calm demeanor had been replaced with an anger and frustration Jada hadn't seen in years. Malcolm ran his hand over his face, his expression a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. He'd built this company with his own hands, crafted it from the ground up, and now it felt like everything he had worked for was slipping through his fingers. And worse, it wasn't just Natalie who had played them. Jada herself had unknowingly become a part of it. She had trusted her, worked with her, and she had been part of Natalie's manipulation from the very start. But even as Jada stood there, grappling with the gravity of it all, one thing became clear. They couldn't let Natalie win. They couldn't let this empire crumble. Dad, Jada said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. We can still fix this. We need to expose her, everything she's done. We can't let her control the narrative. Malcolm looked at her, his eyes hard, but filled with a mix of pride and sorrow. You're right. But this goes deeper than we thought. It's not just about Natalie anymore. If she's been involved in this for years, there's more people we need to uncover. We need to find out who else has been working with her, who's been pulling the strings. Jada nodded. She could feel the urgency in his words, the weight of the responsibility that now rested on both of their shoulders. This wasn't just a matter of saving a company anymore. It was about taking back control of their lives and making sure that someone like Natalie couldn't destroy everything they had built. They spent the next few hours in the conference room, digging through files and emails, trying to make sense of the web of lies Natalie had carefully spun. It wasn't easy. There were fake accounts, doctored documents, and covert communications, all designed to make it look like Malcolm and Jada were the ones behind the leaks. But they were relentless. With each discovery, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, influence, and a desire to see Malcolm fall so that someone else could rise in his place. By the time the sun set, they had gathered enough evidence to make their move. Malcolm called an emergency meeting with the board, ready to expose the full extent of the conspiracy. It was time to end it once and for all. When the meeting finally started, the boardroom was tense. The usual air of calm professionalism had been replaced with a sense of unease. Everyone knew something was off, but no one could quite put their finger on it. Until Malcolm and Jada walked in, their faces set with determination. Malcolm addressed the room, his voice strong but heavy with the weight of the situation. "I know many of you have heard the rumors, but the truth is far worse than any of you could have imagined. There has been a deliberate attempt to undermine everything this company stands for, and I will not let it continue." He motioned for Jada to step forward, and she did so, her nerves steady despite the eyes on her. She had been a part of this company her whole life, but now she was part of something much bigger. "What you've been hearing, it's all been orchestrated by one of our own," Jada began, her voice calm but firm. "Natalie. She's been behind the leaks, the rumors, and the manipulation that's been spreading like wildfire, and she's not alone." There was a ripple of shock around the table as the board members exchanged confused glances. Some looked skeptical, others alarmed, but Jada didn't falter. She laid out the evidence, emails, documents, text messages. When they finished, the room was silent. It wasn't just the shock of the betrayal that hung in the air. It was the realization of how deep the rot ran. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was a calculated attempt to destroy everything they had built, and it was someone they had trusted completely who had made it happen. After a long pause, one of the board members spoke. This is unbelievable. We trusted her. But if this is true, we can't ignore it. We have to act fast." Malcolm nodded grimly. "We're going to take legal action, expose her, and we'll do it in a way that leaves no room for doubt. The company's reputation will not be destroyed by one person's greed." The meeting didn't end immediately, but by the time it did, the course had been set. Natalie's reign of manipulation was over. The board, stunned but resolute, pledged their full support in handling the situation. As they walked out of the conference room, Malcolm turned to Jada. His eyes, still sharp, but now softer with a sense of gratitude, met hers. "You were right, Jada. We couldn't let her win." Jada smiled, the weight of everything they had uncovered still sinking in. "We've always been a team. I'm not letting this company fall without a fight." The following weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, media coverage, and corporate restructuring. But in the end, they had won. Natalie was exposed for her betrayal, her manipulations laid bare for everyone to see. She was arrested for her role in the conspiracy, and the company began to heal from the damage she had caused. But the road ahead wasn't easy. The reputation of the company had been tarnished, and rebuilding trust would take time. However, Jada and her father were more determined than ever to restore what had been broken. They were committed to doing things differently, ensuring that trust and integrity would be at the forefront of everything they did from now on. As they stood together on the balcony of their company headquarters, watching the city lights below, Jada couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had survived the storm, and although the journey had been difficult, they had emerged stronger, more united. Her father turned to her, his gaze soft but proud. "We've been through a lot, Jada, but I couldn't have done this without you." Jada smiled, her heart full. "We did it together, Dad." And in that moment, as the lights of the city twinkled in the distance, they both knew that no matter what came next, they would always stand together. The company would rise again, stronger than before, and with the lessons they had learned deeply embedded in their hearts. The truth had come out, the storm had passed, and in the end, the greatest victory wasn't just reclaiming their company, it was reclaiming their lives and the power to shape their own future.